Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to span the range of the first 23 verses of Mark's 7th chapter. And herein we read the Savior sanctify internal purity above external cleanliness. And this is in the context of Pharisees and scribes. These are the people we haven't met in some times in Mark's account. The war really began in the second and third chapter. He speaks of a healing on the Sabbath, and that was forbidden according to the additional laws of the ceremonial man-made tradition of laws that these men added onto the law of Moses on their own initiative, without authority, without anything else. So there was very little semblance to the divine will to it all. So he's healing on the Sabbath, he is God himself. But they don't know that. But if they did, they would recognize his right to determine what is right to do on the Sabbath. And he says at some point that Sabbath was made for man and not for the Sabbath. Remember, he's the creator. He was there in the beginning and blessed and sanctified the Sabbath. And then we read at the 6th verse of the 3rd chapter that the Pharisees left immediately. That word appears often throughout Mark's account, which is an action-oriented. One gets the sense of urgency and reading it. Immediately went out with the Herodians, the unlikeliest of allies, had formed together in combined conspiracy to kill the dreaded nemesis from Galilee. And the Herodians were the pro-Romans, because Herod owed his position to Rome, so they were partisans of the establishment, whereas Pharisees were more local level synagogues. They exercised religious authority, but they were otherwise hostile and averse to the presence of Gentile occupying powers. The Pharisees literally translates as separatists, so when they began as an idea that they were going to stay away from the Hellenistic culture that was creeping into, infiltrating, and corrupting Judaism, so they decided to separate themselves from the wider world. And then in the passage of time, so it began with a good motive and good intent, but what happened in the passage of time is they started adding laws on top of the already sanctioned and authorized law, and they had the whole list of do's and don'ts of what they had, books this big about what one could and could not do on the Sabbath, the permissible extents in every conceivable scenario. So they were literally obsessed with this legalistic religion, and they became creatures idolized and worshipped. So the way they added to their righteousness, their persona or perception of righteousness, was through external obedience. So they had a lot of emphasis on the ritualistic cleaning, which was not authorized. It was a tradition which they had sanctified on their own authority. So once more we find him in opposition to the traditions of men, and he brings it back to the word of Yahweh, which they had neglected. So and the Pharisees and some of the scribes assembled to him, having come from Jerusalem. And so the religious opposition was gathered in the crowds at this time. This was nothing new. Even though he was embraced by more or less positive crowds on every occasion, wherever he went, there was always someone from the religious establishment there to seek to trap him, to use any words he could say against him. So they were a perpetual presence at this point, more or less. Or they were never far wherever he was between now and the 3rd chapter, and it especially intensifies as he marches towards his death in Jerusalem. But these scribes, incidentally, came from Jerusalem, but he's in Galilee somewhere. But these are, by Jerusalem, they would have carried exceeding high authority, and they were gathered around to trap him. So he has the official notice and attention of the capital and nerve center of the Jewish religious establishment, which brings him down. violently on the cross, which is centrally located in Jerusalem. They were aware of his activities at this point and concerned and interested enough to intervene personally. And seeing some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. So we have to remember that Mark is writing for a Roman Gentile audience, so he has to explain several things, such as Corban. We'll get to that when we get to that. But defiled would have been a uniquely Jewish term, familiar amongst Jews. So eating bread with defiled hands, no other culture had an equivalent or parallel mores. What they had was, but the Jews had these standards of, which was a habitual practice that they customarily did. It was good hygiene, but it was, and good manners, but it really isn't good morals to obsess as laboriously as they did over the unwashed hands. So, there was really nothing wrong with them not washing their hands. Might have been less hygienic, but there was nothing morally wrong with them, yet they found fault. That was what they were there to do. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands thoroughly, holding fast the traditions of the elders. So this is arranged in a parenthetical because Mark, unlike Matthew, is writing to a predominantly Gentile audience. So Matthew, his script assumes certain things that he expects them as Jews to know, but Mark actually has to explain this stuff. So he does give us the detail that we, who are not first century Jews, we are indebted to him for information on the definition of an extent of defiled, and it simply states if they do not wash their hands thoroughly, and it's the tradition of their elders, so they inherited it, but it didn't originate from Moses or Yahweh or any other prophet or anything else. It was of their own making. They had sanctified what was a common practice. And from the marketplace they do not eat unless they wash, and there are many others which they have received and hold fast, the washing of cups and utensils and copper vessels and couches. So the Jews had especially strong hygienic standards, especially given the day and age in which they lived, and there was a reason that the Jewish quarters or ghettos of any major urban metropolis center that was struck by plague in the Middle Ages, the Jewish population always enjoyed a higher survival rate because of these hygienic standards. So these were miles away from what people were doing in the Middle Ages. They were, throwing dead bodies in the river with the drinking water. So the Jews did have a lot of there was some advantage in this practice. But that concludes the parentheses, the explanation. Then we return to, then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the traditions of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? So their argument is invalidated by its own words. The traditions of the elders. Who are these elders? They are not authorized. They are not recognized by, unbeknownst to them, God in the flesh. The word incarnate is walking among them. They just see a human, one that they are literally there to kill. It is for the express purpose that they were so diligently and laboriously following him, because he had violated their Sabbath law on an early occasion, and then from there he's just they're hounding him. They're at his foot door and footstop, but they really have no case because they rested their argument on the words according to the traditions of the elders. Who are they to him who is supreme and eternal? And he answering said to them, Well did Isaiah prophesy concerning you hypocrites, as it has been written, this people respect me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. So he quotes Isaiah 29:13, I believe. So he uses the words of prophecy that these Pharisees claimed to believe in. They were distinct from their Sadducean counterparts, and they accepted the writings of the prophets as canonical. And he's using Isaiah's words spoken some 7 centuries ago and applying it to them. There was a problem with superficial mechanical observance. The book of Isaiah opens with an indictment against the overemphasis on animal sacrifices. I've had enough of your burnt offerings. But there is a lip service religion, and the Pharisees were especially prone to this. The religious practices, the hypocritical potential for even what should be noble and selfless religious deeds were corrupted by their hypocrisy, and one of their ways was in prayer. Their express fault was praying publicly and for adulation, and it's just lip service religion. You weren't there, you're not literally praying, you're just putting yourself on a pedestal by giving Yahweh eloquent sounding words that are divorced from the true nature of your heart, and you're just trying to impress the crowd all around you. That is that defeats the very purpose of prayer. And anyone whose heart, they're claiming the traditions, there's an element of sanctification with that, but that's just shows how far their hearts are removed from God. The fact that they're very unwittingly opposing him in his very presence just adds another element of dimension to it. And in vain do they worship me, teaching as teachings, the commands of men. So the worship and false teaching are closely connected. The vain worship, the loud, exaggerated, elongated prayers, the beating of the breast when one is fasting, and just the almsgiving, the noisy almsgiving. This covers the range in the reverse order, or jumbled order in Matthew 6 chapter. But they were mistaking. They were teaching the commands of men and not the commands of Yahweh. So they were telling them they were exalting their own self-created rules and traditions on the same pedestal as the divinely sanctioned, the divinely inspired, and the divinely authorized word. And that is a form of blasphemy, objectively speaking. Forsaking the command of Elohim, you hold fast the traditions of men, washing of pots and cups, and many others, other like matters. So this is an end quote. The previous verse ended with an end quote of the Isaiah citation. He's speaking to them in their present situation. So that in exalting their own traditions and own creations and own rules, they were abandoning or forsaking the command of Elohim. And this is the effect of the cause of holding fast the tradition of men among them, which specifically and immediately applied to their overburdened concern for hygiene. And he said to them, well do you put aside the command of Elohim in order to guard your traditions. So he repeats something twice and almost immediately that they are putting aside or forsaking or abandoning the commandment of Elohim in defense and in promotion of their own tradition. This endless pile of rules that they had conceived and crafted of their own volition, but not authority or approval, were the marks and measures of righteousness. So they had it backwards. Piety, true, genuine piety, is more than external. It is eternal, as the Savior eventually concludes in explanation. And and he just gives it an example of Corban, which was one of the religious corrupt religious practices in circulation then and there. And he said to them, well, do you put for Moses said, respect your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. So the law of Moses, this is familiar of the Decalogue, the fifth commandment, and it gives both the positive followed by the negative thing of this commandment. So there was, in fact, this was a crime that was subjectable to capital offense. Probably not as a routine matter, of course, but it was written and intended, so there was a lot of people and practices that a single indulgence could eliminate your life from the presence of the community of the covenant, whose purity was so sacrosanct that but they are implicitly violating Moses, and he's going to tell us how they are doing it in the next verse. But when you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban, that is a gift, you let him do not at all for his father or mother. So the Corban, as he explained, is a gift, and this was a bribe of sorts through which sinners could bribe the corrupt temple, who should know better, into giving a blanket of protection. They could pay this money to the temple in lieu of as a blanket of looking the other way for their disrespect for their parents. And the upholders and enforcers and maintainers of the temples and synagogues would allowed this to happen, so they have no one to blame but themselves for instilling the breakdown in children respecting their parents with all due deference in accordance to the laws of Yahweh. Nullifying the word of Elohim through your traditions which you have handed down, and many such like you do. So this isn't the only one. He's just giving an example. He's elaborating, but he only has so much time with them. But this is more than one thing. This is just but one example in which they nullify the word of Elohim, whose command they had forsaken, and who had put aside his command in replacement and in subordinate station to their own invented rules. And there was a lot of these going on. And calling the crowd to him, he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. So after, this confrontation and counter exchange and conversation in all likelihood took place publicly, where it would have been beheld and witnessed by a crowd who was able to he had won the argument and successfully silenced the opposition, who at this time had walked away defeated, or their heads were hanging low. And he turns to the crowd and he says in as many words, what I have to say is important, so pay attention. There is no matter that enters a man from the outside which is able to defile him, but is what comes out of him that defiles the man. So this is in contradistinction to everything that this audience would have been accustomed to and conditioned towards as first century Jews. That they had an overemphasis, which was as leadership so much rises and revolves around leadership, and these Pharisees were leaders at the synagogue level. So they had it all backwards. They had a whole country and society thinking that external purity and ceremonial cleanliness is more worthy and acceptable to Yahweh than the inner purity, the purity that comes from within, and it cannot be measured. The illusion of legalism is that it can measure righteousness according to quantifiable material or information or data, but that's not the way righteousness works. It comes from faith, which has no measure or observable exponents. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. He's saying once more in as many words, what I have to say is important. Pay attention. This is a phrase we read often in the Gospels and in the book of Revelation. He addresses all 7 churches in Asia Minor in chapters 2 and 3 with usually with that line in there. And when he went from the crowd into a house, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So the end of this answer, he's going to basically repeat himself, but the disciples are genuinely perplexed at the meaning and significance and interpretation of his parable. They have the familiarity to approach him and confess their ignorance in order that he might reverse it or unbound it. And so many times after the utterances of parables, and this was not exactly a parable, but it's categorized here nonetheless. And he said to them, "Are you also without understanding? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from the outside is unable to defile him?" So he's repeating himself once more, and he's asking them if they see that what defiles the washing of the hands. It just it cannot defile. You cannot defile yourself by not washing your hands or by not doing anything that was of these traditions of men, these externally observable and measurable, legalistic, unnecessarily and excessive legalistic, that does not make one righteous, nor does it do anything lack thereof defile it. Because it does not enter his heart but his stomach, and is cast out in the sewer, thus purging all the foods. So he's talking about something else entirely here. The Pharisees were talking about the washing of the hands, and now he's broadening and expanding the analogy and parable in the presence of the disciples, and he's extending it to the food. And the Jews at this time had their categories and classes of unclean and clean foods, according to which one might be defiled. There was forbidden foods in the Mosaic dietary law, but he was abolishing that, even though we find Peter eating in a kosher household as late as Acts 10:14. He did not immediately intuit the message. And he says, what comes out of a man that defiles a man? So it's not what goes into you, it's what comes out of you, and this is a reflection of your own internal state. So the words of our mouth are measures of the spirit and condition of our heart and our spirit. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed all evil reasonings, adulteries, whorings, murders, thefts, greedy desires, wickednesses, deceits, indecency, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. So that's a whole laundry list of things you don't want to be, but that's what you'll be if you do not tend to the cultivation and conditioning of one's heart. You will be any or all of the above. So from the heart proceeds the wicked things, the evil reasonings, and one adultery begins in the heart. That's when you lust and covet after another woman sexually, and you have defiled her, according to the Master's exalted stand. He who commits adultery in the heart has committed it. Who commits adultery with the eyes, the lust of the eyes, has committed it in his heart already, thus reducing even lusting after a woman to the moral equivalent of adultery itself, the act thereof. Whorings, that's a sexual sin. Murders, these are self-evident. You can't have a society when people have license to take personal vengeance or inflict retributive justice outside the law by killing people who offend them or injure them or threaten them or anything else. It's just the society ceases to function when a man is not safe in his property or possessions. And so greedy desires, this is covetousness, this is a sin. It's forbidden desires, it is beyond necessary or natural. In other words, what you need, the mandatory minimum to survive. Anything really above that is sort of a greedy desire. Wickedness, that kind of describes everything. It's the broader term for the specific witnesses, such as deceit. That's lying. Again, society, the entire fabric of the society is unraveled when dishonesty, when a man's word can no longer mean what he says it to mean. Deceit does ruin individuals, relationships, and societies, as does indecency. It seems that this sin is increasing exponentially in my lifetime. Just watching the television that was appropriate even in the 1980s was when I was born, and what it's just become in the passage of my life. We need to keep a lid on the indecency. Evil eye, our eyes are a source of evil that can lead us to evil. We don't have to be looking for evil. Evil can find us without us looking for it, but still an evil eye, an eye motivated and oriented towards and inclined towards evil, is it's a heart problem once again. Blasphemy is just the sin of usurping the divine prerogatives, or belittling or exalting man or oneself, or belittling or demeaning in any way, shape, or form the power of Yahweh. And I earlier classified that they're forsaking, they're prioritizing their own traditions above the commandments and laws of Elohim, was as a form of blasphemy. Pride, this is the original sin that caused Lucifer to fall, and before pride cometh a ruin, we read of in Proverbs 16:18. So before pride is the precipitational causational effect of ruin, it leads nowhere good, and it is a dangerous sin. And foolishness, of course, is of no use or value to the fool or anyone else. We have to eliminate the foolishness in us and the foolish among us. All the wickedness comes from within and defiles a man. So at the heart of every problem lays the problem of the heart. So that's where we need to focus our attention and concentrations and efforts and energies on, is the heart, the inside, the things we cannot see, rather than outer appearances. So true righteousness, true piety, true virtue comes from within and not from without. It is the heart which determines the character of the worshiper and the worth of the disciple. So it's not, we can impress others with the amount of measurable works we do, but it's ultimately invalid and nullified by the supreme priority as authorized by the Savior himself on inner purity above external religiosity. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today once more. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.